Sexuality doesn't have to end because you have a severe injury. It just needs reframing.
When survivors are asked, what would you like? Routinely, they say, we want to be asked about it.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Wired for Hope. I'm Dr. Jess, a clinical psychologist, university lecturer, and published author. On Wired for Hope, we talk about all things brain injury, cognition, and mental health. If you like this episode, you can like and subscribe, and you can also follow me on Instagram at Dr. Jess Neuropsych or at Wired for Hope podcast. Without further ado, please enjoy the episode today. Today we have Bea Meadow, who is a somatic sexologist, a somatic consent educator, and a retired conscious sex worker. And we also have Dr. Giles Yates, who's a clinical neuropsychologist and couples counselor, and a specialist in relationship therapy after traumatic brain injury. Thank you so much for coming today. I've been so excited about doing this episode since the inception of this podcast 7 months ago. I think that's when I reached out to you, maybe 7 months ago. So this is really exciting for me that we're talking about sex, disability, and traumatic brain injury today. So thanks for coming. I wondered if we could start just by maybe thinking about explaining in layman's terms what you both do and how you would describe your profession to listeners. And then I want to start to think about why we need to talk about sex, disability, and traumatic brain injury and what the risks are if we're not talking about it. So can I, start with yourself?
My work intersects with conscious sex work, working with marginalized groups, the disabled community, mature adult virgins, incels, neurodivergent clients, and I'm supporting, helping, guiding, coaching them to have healthy sexual expression using the somatic consent framework, the Wheel of Consent. And I suppose what's unique about my role is that I'm specifically working with people who have been desexualized, medicalized, infantilized, where there are barriers to healthy sexual expression. So my job is to kind of get rid of those barriers, because sexual intimacy, relationships, and pleasure is a basic human right.
Amazing. And just so people are kind of understanding, what kind of tools do you use, or how do you support people to feel more in touch with their sexuality and just to describe so people can understand?
Well, so there are many tools that I use, but I come from a background of dance movement therapy. So that's where the somatics come in. That's where I learned that my body can actually be an intervention, like a therapeutic tool in the space. Mm-hmm. And as we know, sex and intimacy, can be a solo expression, but generally speaking, you require another person to do that. So in the same way that you can't learn to drive a car just by thinking about it or playing, what is it, GTA? Yeah, you actually have to get in the car and learn with an instructor. So I suppose in my capacity as a somatic sex worker, if you like, my body is a tool, but also we are not working for adult entertainment. Mm-hmm. This is about health and well-being. So, and there is a whole cohort of practitioners that are currently being trained in somatic sexological practices. So it's really exciting development in the field of sexology. It's not actually officially recognized yet, although we're getting better. I was able to get insurance for my work, and the NHS actually did subsidize for one client briefly. But we can talk about a bit more about finances and funding later.
Yes, definitely.
Because it always comes down to money at the end of the day, usually. Yeah. Not always, but often.
Yeah, and recognition of need.
Exactly.
And is sex recognized, and is it recognized as something important?
So I intersects with So conscious sex worker, yes, partner surrogacy, but also advocacy and consulting, and coaching and training.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. And for yourself, Giles, how would you describe what you
So
do?
my official title is I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, and my particular interest over my career has been working with emotions and relationships after brain injury. So, traumatic brain injury, stroke, any kind of event that happens suddenly to someone and leaves a legacy for a lifetime.
Okay.
I've done some extra training and things in different types of therapies, and I'm a couples therapist. I'm trained in emotionally focused couples therapy as well, and that's been part of making relationships and emotions the core business of a clinical neuropsychologist, which it hasn't been up until it still is marginal, I'd say, but that's been the core of what I've been doing. And within that, what's led me to interest are the conversations from survivors of brain injury that are marginalized. Things that I've noticed, like, oh, these people really want to talk about this, and yet it seems to stop the conversation in a team of clinicians, or there's no response, or sometimes I have no response. And I'd say, like, the three top ones for those survivors are love, sex, and spirituality.
Wow.
Yeah, those just don't go anywhere in a rehab conversation.
Okay.
I think those ones have. I felt kind of duty bound to at least be someone that tries to take that forward and offers a response to that conversational invitation and link with people who are invested in those marginalized and shadow areas of support. Yeah.
Sex, love, and spirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just so I can understand, how would you describe what you think the core business of neuropsychologists kind of culturally is?
Well, what it has been,
Yeah,
you
what it
mean?
has been versus kind of how you want to be thinking about things.
I think in the UK, it's and along with many countries, it's initially like a voyeuristic trend of assessing and watching, and not necessarily doing anything beyond feeding back results. So I think that's
Of
a
pen
place
and
where it
paper
started.
tasks. Yeah.
Paper tests and memory tests and
Yeah.
things like that. And that remains, obviously, it's an important aspect to it, and definitely core within, I suppose, hospital settings. But I've always worked in community settings, and my my first training in rehab was under Barbara Wilson at the Oliver Zangwill Centre, which has always been a practical, like, there is always something to be done to help. So it's a radical pragmatism
Okay.
that neuropsychology in neurorehab is about helping and doing, and particularly in the community kind of context, working with the messiness of social complexity. And I think then during my career, with some amazing colleagues, and our training model in the UK meant that psychological therapists are part of clinical neuropsychology identity. So emotion is definitely definitely on the books for anyone working in a rehab or community setting, and there's lots of different skills that have been brought into bear. And I think so. Then on the edges of that, still the relationships, working with multiple people in the room. And then things like sex and spirituality, those are things that are still on the edges. But that core remit of clinical neuropsychology has definitely kind of diversified in 20 odd years I've been working.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And one thing I really want to talk about today as we get into it is thinking about emotions, because people's emotional world can change so drastically after a head injury, and also social cognition and understanding the nuance of human relationship. That's so hard anyways. And then on top of that, to have some brain changes that might impact the way that you're relating to others feels so relevant and so important in this context.
Yeah.
And maybe we could just start also by thinking about, why do we need to be having conversations about sex, relationships, and TBI? And what is the risk if we're not having those conversations, if they're quiet and marginalized and on the side?
So in my practice, and I consulted on 4 clients with TBI. 2 I ended up working with, and 2 I didn't end up working with. And one of the reasons for one of the clients was because there were behaviours of concern, and I was unable to bring this into our sessions together. I had to not bring it up. And ethically for me, that felt like it was a barrier to the therapeutic process of our sessions. And I think that, well, in sexology at least, if your sexuality is repressed or suppressed, it will come out in one way or another. And, often we see behaviours of concern, and that was my particular experience with the clients that I was working with.
I think for me, I'll come in from the kind of first the knowledge base. What's the bigger view of what's understood about all kind of sexual changes after brain injury, and the research. There's some amazing research done in Australia and Canada, and when investigating this, the main kind of sexuality change is a reduction. So there's a loss of libido. It's hyposexual changes, loss of libido, loss of sexual opportunity, loss of sexual expression, loss of self-esteem, self-efficacy. The direction is kind of downward to inertia and nothingness. And that makes a really unholy bedfellow with the professional tendency to not ask about it. So both those two things consigns this whole sphere into the shadows.
Okay.
And when survivors ask, what would you like? Routinely, they say, we want to be asked about it. We want to be talked about it. And then there's a smaller group. There's a kind of 10% where there are hypersexual changes, where there are increase in libido, arousal, difficulties regulating that kind of nudges. Well, everything nudges on other people, but this draws attention in terms of concern and risk. And again, if the whole area is in the shadows, that's not the best way to manage risk, by not talking about it and not thinking about it and bringing sophisticated thinking to sexuality change. Because as you said, Bea, actually, the roots to an expression of someone's sexual identity are so complicated before you get to a lesion in someone's brain. It's as any psychological therapist, and from Freud onwards, that sex is the royal road to the unconscious, and everything goes through it. So it's all there, and it's complicated. So that is a very multifaceted and dangerous entity to be consigned to the shadows. Okay. Not just dangerous risk, but also just an absolute shame, because it's core to our identity as human beings, right? And I think I said before that neurorehab can have a radical aspect to it, in terms of, with this, it's not radical at all. Traditionally, it's been follow conservative trends to keep this stuff out of the conversation.
Why do you think we're not asking?
Discomfort. And I think that's really interesting, because I do teaching on this around the world, and I always check, like, what's the deal with talking about sex? And the assumption is in Britain that we're least likely to do that compared to other countries. But I've actually found lots of different interesting trends, that a lot of people, there's actually a trend of pragmatism in Britain. Like, even if it's difficult to talk about sex in terms of people's personal lives, there's kind of an open pragmatism in other spheres to make that an open conversation to support people, and particularly with kind of disability. The disability sexuality movement is very powerful. Yeah, outside of rehab, and again, very radical, very subversive, very powerful, and that's quite unique, I think, to a kind of Northwest European identity. I'm not so sure about the States, but when I compare it to something like, I've talked in Italy, and I would assume that would be more open in Italy, but because of the there's a compartmentalization there of them. It's very medicalized. You can't have these conversations as professionals, and
Yeah.
it's that you can't have supportive conversations in a professional role. So that's even harder to get that out of the shadows, I thought. And I was in Chile the other month doing something and a similar thing. So lots of surprises. And when I was speaking in South Africa a couple of years ago, I mentioned the idea of sexual surrogates, and the whole room just gasped. It was audible. Like, we're not there yet.
Isn't it true that in Holland they have this state-funded? They very inappropriately call it hookers for the handicapped.
Oh,
and it is
God.
state
Really?
funded. Yeah.
I
mean, but
remember
that's Holland. They're
watching-
quite progressive with their sexuality, aren't they? Yeah.
Well, I remember watching that. I think when I was on training, there's a YouTube video talking about sex and disability and access to sex. And since that time, I've been thinking about it. And here we are 7 years later.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting.
And did you watch the movie The Sessions?
No, I didn't. Not yet. I
Have you
need
watched
to.
the movie The
Sorry.
Sessions?
It's
No.
been a busy week.
You all need to go and watch the movie
Okay.
The Sessions. It's about partner surrogate and true story of Mark O'Brien, who was a polio survivor. He contracted when he was a kid and spent most of his life in an iron lung and got to 50s and he was still a virgin, but was deeply Christian and had to go to his bishop or his priest to get a free pass to lose his virginity. And then he hired Helen Hunt, who was his surrogate, and they did The Sessions. It's a beautiful movie. Yeah. And if you want an example of how, this work or sexual surrogacy or partner surrogacy, as we call it, or conscious sex workers, there's lots of different names that we use. That would be a beautiful example of how the work can really benefit not just ABI, but disability across the board.
Yeah. So actually, you said something there that I feel like there's an interesting parallel here, sort of almost asking this bishop for permission, right? And I was thinking about carers and people who exist in the orbit of someone with an ABI or another kind of disability. And we were talking about how sometimes people with very severe disabilities, for example, they do need support from carers to access sex and things like that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, this dynamic between someone who is a carer and then someone who identifies as having a disability, and just how that kind of complicated relationship is navigated in order to access partner surrogacy.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about access to healthy sexual expression, the barriers or the breaks, if you like, can come from many different places. So carers, a care management team, for example, it could be that you're born in a particular culture where sexual expression is quite suppressed. It could be an environmental barrier to access, like a mobility, taking a wheelchair into a sex shop, but then there's no ramp, or, a million barriers to healthy sexual expression. But, I mean, imagine if you are, a man who doesn't have mobility, who is unable to masturbate. You need facilitation or enabling to just have that basic, what most of men would take for granted, and so how is that going to work? Who's going to do that? Is it the carer's job? No, well, absolutely not. So, because there is no one to actually provide this as a service, the conversation stops before it even gets started, because this is about supply and demand in a way. And traditional sex work might be one route to go down, but because a lot of disabled clients are considered vulnerable and there is a safeguarding element around them, and also there's a capacity question that's involved, it suddenly becomes very, very complex. And what's considered to us to be a private thing that we only share with people that we want to know about our sex life, with somebody with a disability, they might have to involve a whole bunch of people for them to have healthy sexual expression.
And what was really interesting is you were telling me about some of the laws, I think, in the UK around carers. So first of all, accessing sex work, I'm wondering if you can just explain what the laws are in the UK, but then how this is particularly complicated for people who might need a carer to help them access healthy sexual
Well,
expression.
I might need Giles to jump in on this because so the law is constantly changing. There are constant cases going through court of protections, but basic sex work is legal in the UK. Always has been legal, and there's no law going through to make it illegal. It's more about the carers, and there are nuances in the law. So, for example, brothels are illegal. Two practitioners working out of one building is illegal. There's a term, facilitate. You understand. You know a little bit more about the law than I do.
Maybe we could chip in our respective bits of knowledge.
Yeah.
So there's two overlapping bits of legislation. There's the Mental Capacity Act and the Sexual Offences Act, and where they intersect is where there are problems, because both come from a place of protection of vulnerable people, and we can unpack how you protect multiple vulnerable people at the same time, but we could dip into this maybe throughout this conversation. But where this is that if someone has been found to lack capacity through a disorder of brain and mind in both engaging sexual relationships, but also maybe adjunct abilities like managing finances to secure the services of a sexual surrogate, or getting somewhere to meet someone who's providing services and needs someone else, then you stumble into the Sexual Offences Act, which results legally is you might be inciting sexual
inciting. That's the word. You're inciting sexual.
It's such a loaded term as well. Inciting a sexual activity for someone who's vulnerable in the role of a carer. The carer means any kind of formal role. So it would be any clinician, it would be a solicitor, a deputy, managed finances.
Mother, father?
I'm not sure. This is where I'm not so sure about that. And this is where actually people, the ambiguity of that role is where these things still get facilitated.
Gotcha.
But definitely, if you were paid in any capacity, or you have any formal role, then you are considered a carer. And so that means that leads to all kinds of things. There's all so that was that was used in case law to make a judgment against the wishes to support someone with disabilities to access a sexual surrogate. Loads of other things come out of that. It's worth just saying, because this conversation just focuses on accessing a sexual surrogate. Loads of other things come out. I'll give you some examples of my work. Someone I work with wants to meet regularly with a dominatrix. There's no touch involved. She commands, he obeys. Can't do it for those reasons.
Can't do it for...
He can't, that's considered a sexual activity, so he can't be supported. No touch.
Okay.
Wow.
And who says no? Sorry, the law.
This is the legal advice.
The parameters. Okay.
He can go to a sex shop.
Yeah.
And does enjoy going to a sex shop. Can't go to a strip club, a pole dancing club. And then when it gets to any kind of interaction with a human being that's I think the term is reasonably viewed as sexual in nature, that's when that law kicks in.
Okay.
The more profound other example is, I've heard from a solicitor said that a married couple who both had disabilities and were in different care homes would meet on a Sunday to be intimate together, and needed support workers to take them to meet from one care to the other, no longer able to because of the same legislation, because they were being that incitement was viewed as people getting involved to bring two people, even though they were a married couple.
We are so
there's the example
around sex, and it's written into the law.
Yeah, I mean, another example would be a couple that are both severely disabled, that have fallen in love with each other, they're having a relationship, they want to be able to have sex, but they actually need to physically be put together to be able to have sex.
Yeah.
So that's a case of what we would call enabling or facilitating. But the carer who books me for that would be inciting. But in this case, there isn't a safeguarding court protection around them, and so I feel very comfortable about doing that and facilitating that, because it's not murky.
Yes.
And I would say that with that one kind of legal concern context from these two pieces of legislation, I just want to, on behalf of Claire Dutan, who is the solicitor barrister behind the TLC Trust and things like that, and we'll talk more about that later on. She would say you should be equally concerned about violating the European Court of Human Rights law,
which says
that every human being has the right to sexual expression.
Not just that, but the right to get an STI, the right to get somebody pregnant, the right to make sexual mistakes, and there's this trend in, because of litigation, I suppose, that we overprotect and, wrap disabled people up in cotton wool. But, that is an infringement on their human rights.
Yeah.
And I always say that my clients have, just as much right to get drunk, have sex that they regret, and just like everybody else, if there isn't a capacity question.
And people with disabilities need people to be the conduit and the access to fulfill that right.
Yes.
So I think she's absolutely right. We should hold that in mind and be nervous about that.
Being too restrictive. Yeah. It has me thinking about Mental Capacity Act, 2005, the right to make unwise decisions. Absolutely. If you can remember the information, if you can communicate the information, if you can weigh it up, you can think about the pros and cons. You are well within your rights to make a decision that somebody else might deem to be unwise. And this feels like an important area, I think, a nuanced area to discuss, because I work with a lot of folk, and after they've had a brain injury, capacity around specific decisions is often explored. I must admit, sex does not come up very often, which is interesting. But you mentioned something that feels important, and we spoke about it earlier. So we're not just thinking about safety, capacity, consent of someone with a disability, but we also might want to be thinking about safety of someone who is in conscious sex work, and like what these two kind of people, these two humans we want to be thinking about. So what are the discussions around that? What are the considerations around looking after both people having a really good time?
So I think what separates my work from traditional sex work is that I am a member of a professional body, the Association of Integrative Somatic Sexologists. We get insurance for our work. We have supervision for our work. We have a code of ethics that we have to abide by. And for me personally, the way that I work is I conduct a thorough assessment where I'm capturing a client's needs, wants, and desires, and barriers, and things like, for me personally, I only sign up for 6 sessions initially, because one of the things that we see in TBI is a fixation, and I don't want clients to become fixated on me. So it's like, okay, we can do 6 sessions, then we do a review and see where we're up to and see what needs to happen next. So that's kind of one way that I protect myself. I also won't work with someone who's got an active mental health diagnosis where their sense of self isn't that strong. And so what I'm looking for with TBI is, can they respect my boundaries from the offset, and I'll set little kind of tests. I'm remembering one particular client who I ended up only doing 2 sessions with, and then I terminated the sessions because he was unable to stick to the boundaries that I set. And I think that I misread the situation, because he contacted me himself, so it wasn't through a carer or any of his care team. And he called me, which threw me, because I don't normally take calls from clients, so I'm not really sure how he got my number, but he called me and he had a speech impairment. And because I've worked with clients with speech impairments before, it didn't throw me, so I gave him my time. And because I gave him my time and he felt heard, and we were talking about sex and intimacy, and he was 2 years post-injury and hadn't had any sexual expression, and he was a younger man, he fixated on me, and that became really problematic further on down the line. And I think what's really challenging for me as a practitioner is very difficult for me to tell if the way that they are behaving is part of their injury, or if they were like that before their injury. So when I see clients that can't respect boundaries, and have this kind of sense of entitlement or unrealistic expectations, or aren't able to engage with the process where I don't allow myself to be objectified and I'm not there for performance or for their gratification, and if they can't work within that, then is that the brain injury, or is that who they were as a person before, because they were a Jack the Lad and they were used to getting it their own way? And that's really incredibly difficult. And that's why sometimes I'll ask, Giles, for example, or reach out to a professional to see, what's going on.
To work together.
Yeah.
And that dialogue is so important, because I just think I want to place that care and consideration and that protection in your role in the wider context of sex work, and the context of trafficking of women, of links to organized crime and things. And one of the risks about this stuff being in the shadows is that the routes that many people might find to paying for a sexual encounter might be to negotiate all of that uncertainty with the status and the vulnerability of the provider, what they're walking to, their own safety. I mean, that actually is part of my capacity assessment, to check out someone's understanding of the context of potential trafficking in an encounter and things like that. But then you think, how many men who don't have disability would think that when they pay for sex as well?
Exactly.
Which is really interesting. So, so having kind of formal, trusted routes and providers with the standards and protections that Bea describes is so important. And that gets eroded by this stuff being in the shadows, I think.
And actually, sorry to put you on the spot, but there will be some clinicians listening to this. I'm also really curious. But when you're thinking about a capacity assessment, you're thinking about sex and relationships with someone after they've had a brain injury, what are some of those questions that you might ask, that you might be looking to understand?
Okay, you want to go into it?
Yeah, I want to get a pen and paper.
As long as we have time to talk about the supportive stuff as well, because some of this stuff captures all the attention, but I'll go a quick run through. Yeah. So in terms of the law has a really low bar, right? There's the in terms of capacity for sex, there's knowledge of the sexual act, and knowledge around heterosexual penetrative sex, essentially, and knowledge of the mechanics involved, risks involved, the connection to conception and pregnancy. That's evolved in case we're to consider the capacity to engage in sexual relationships, which then opens things up. But I've seen a lot of sexual capacity assessment writers that don't go to that second bit, but that's where it's all about.
So it's mostly heterosexual penetrative.
But to the engagement bit, that's an engagement, it's an interaction with another person. And that's when everything opens up. But just to the form, in terms of knowledge, I've worked with people who've had a brain injury as a child, and I'm seeing them as an adult, and their education and social trajectory may have prevented them or limited their acquisition of that knowledge. So find out what people know about sex is important. What people know about what legal and illegal sex is. What is under the umbrella of a sexual activity between two or more people, and so that kind of the knowledge stuff is there. Knowledge of sexual health and STIs and things like that, and that can really, the application of that knowledge isn't a straightforward thing. Some people might know it, they may have lost it, or they may apply it in very restricted ways. So, often with people who know about STIs, but will engage in unprotected sex with a sex worker because he or she will say they just do it with them, and they're careful with all their other clients, and it feeds with an egocentric view that I'm getting something special. They don't think about them as part of a network of sexual contacts and things like that. So there's like an egocentricity about applying that knowledge, like, oh, I can take risks because he or she is just doing it for me.
So without appraising the potential other risks.
Exactly,
or
and just not extending that consideration outwards. So, so just knowing something, and it, as you know, of mental capacity, and knowing something, and the paradox of applying that is a whole different world. When you get into the engagement with, and again, knowledge then about, I do include knowledge about an understanding about the different contexts in which a sexual surrogate may provide services, and how you access that, and the risks of trafficking and things like in crime and safety and things like that.
Gotcha.
And then the engagement bit, which is actually, I think, where all of the detail and the complexity. How is this person relating to another mind? And we'll get into consent and things like that. But how is someone interacting with a potential sexual partner in the context of dating? That's the most complicated. So when does a friendship start becoming having shades of flirtation, having shades of invitation, and the knowledge that invitation and consent can be withdrawn at any point, both for the person and another person. There's a really interesting study by Gill and colleagues in 2011 that people with cognitive flexibility difficulties and difficulty attentional switching really struggle with spontaneity, like with a potential partner. Oh, we're watching TV. What's happening now? Something else is happening. We're not watching TV anymore. So to think about intimate encounters, often intimate encounters evolve from one kind of meeting to something else based on really subtle changing cues.
Yeah, and what you just described there is really relevant to people with that are neurodivergent as well. Yeah, you see a similar crossover with TBI and neurodivergent in some respects.
It's so complicated. When you think about all the cognitive demands and requirements of sussing out a situation and reading the room, and all the non-verbals and the embodied nature of that can all either never develop in the first place or be lost or go wrong so quickly, so easily, in such a complicated way. So this is where, for me, the neuropsychologist has a role to tease out in what way is a connection with someone not happening or aligning, be it in a dating context, in a long-term relationship context, in a sex club context, in a sexual surrogate meeting context, or in a sex coach context, because all of those things they're all different situations that have different kinds of feedback from the other person as well, which is key. How do you think about this in an absence of feedback from someone else, to someone like yourself, doing the mentalizing coaching? No, this is what it's like for me. This is what needs to happen. This is how I feel. This is that. I mean, there's a whole potential, but unfortunately underexploited resource there of therapeutic work.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things there. So.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I'm going to summarize that later with AI. But just to say, with mentalizing, so kind of being able to know what's in your own heart and your own mind, and then being able to have a good guess at what might be in someone else's mind and in their heart as well. So being able to kind of, think across yourself and another.
But also feeling as well. So to give an example, I work with a couple of stroke survivor who has a difficulty of interoception, so having the kind of right bodily signals when in a social interaction with someone else. And he would say, this is with his married partner of 40 odd years, we used to have an intimate encounter, and everyone would feel right, and we'd flow together, and we'd get turned on together, and we're getting really into each other. I can feel it in my body. It's like fire. It's amazing. That now, at the very moment that should be happening, my heart feels wrong. My heart feels wrong. My gut feels wrong. I feel wrong in my body at the very time. In my head, I can remember feeling absolutely right. So I have no idea what I should be doing. I have to kind of do it a kind of as a decision making in a cold way, I've lost that ability to feel into this. And maybe people never acquire that ability and need to develop that. And then I asked his partner, and she goes, in those moments my heart breaks because I'm getting pushed away by a kiss. I'm getting betrayed and pushed away by a kiss. I have an imposter kissing me. So all those moments, so that understanding what someone else is thinking and feeling, but feeling what someone else is thinking, feeling and wanting, the you know, the proximity and uniting of two bodies is all part of this, right? So it's again, it's so complicated.
It's so complicated, and it's having me think about the meaning of the somatic, the importance of the somatic experience. And I'm just thinking about how do we support people to be in touch with that part of them. And then also think about consent. You were talking to me about somatic consent. Can you describe a little bit more about that?
So I use a framework called the Wheel of Consent, and the basis of it is that at any point in time when there's interaction between two people, the question is, who's it for? Who's this for? And I need to make sure that clients can hear a no from me. Like it's the difference between, a traditional sex worker will be kind of like McDonald's. They've got the list, the menu of the services, and the client books the service and pays the money and has the service. And when we're working with consent and boundaries and interoception and what's happening in the body and how are you feeling and why do you want this, and unpacking it all, because it's a huge landscape. When we talk about the word sex, let's have sex, I mean, that in and of itself is so vague. What kind of sex? PIV sex, anal sex, oral sex, what am I actually consenting and signing up for? So it's about getting really specific about making requests about what you want. And then tuning in, both of us, me and them, because I'm not performing, I'm not servicing clients, and tuning in whether it's a yes and a no, and where do they feel the yes in their body, where do they feel the no in their body? Can they hear my no and be okay with rejection? Can I hear their no? And it's not until we have thoroughly negotiated, because it is a negotiation, we negotiated consent, that anything then actually happens. And this is modeling what healthy sexual interactions are in the outside world.
One would hope.
One would hope.
Yeah.
So instead of going to McDonald's and ordering off the menu, you go in the kitchen with a chef and you look at all the ingredients and all of the equipment. You make a meal together and then you eat it together. So the learning really lands in the body because it's been a whole experience, as opposed to just ordering something, consuming, not least the fact that you're going to be hungry again, like a few hours later.
So this is kind of where the consent and education part comes in.
Yeah, and that's why it's more conscious, and why I still don't have the right terminology for what I actually do, because partner surrogacy is not really recognised in this country. There isn't any really official training for partner surrogates, so it's kind of like something that I've created myself, and there's been lots of different labels: conscious sex worker, intimacy coach, somatic sex educator, and all of us that are working in this space, all of us sexuality practitioners, all call ourselves something different. So in terms of actually finding a practitioner that can work with clients is a bit of a minefield at the moment.
There's more stuff I kind of want to ask around consent, but I also want to think about finances and how people get access. I'm also really curious to think about some examples.
Financially, that's good. Fine. So in terms of, I work with someone who had a liberated financial deputy, that a solicitor that managed finances, that was committed to supporting their sexual identity, both before and after the case law that Bea mentioned that has frozen a lot of people in their tracks and worry about inciting sexual activity under the sexual offence. So the basic practical arrangement, and I think this is the most common workaround that people are doing. You mentioned family and friends. That family and friends have a role in making things happen, with using a, an amount of money that's available as a weekly spend money for a survivor, if they're getting medical. So this, sorry, to go more broadly, this is in a privately funded post-accident or court case where there's a pocket money, like we said, in Australia, this is so formalized that insurers have a code for the release of money to access sexual services.
Okay.
So there are other countries where this is no, as ambiguity.
I did have, actually, just jumping in, I did have a solicitor or one of the insurers contact me, asked me about my job and said, how much money should we allocate our client for sexual services for the rest of their life? And I said, are you basically asking me how often should that person have sex? It was such the weirdest thing. But great that money is being allocated as part of compensation claims and care packages. Yeah.
So that's the kind of workaround where no one in a formal helping capacity gets identified as inciting, but things are kind of arranged such that the opportunity is there. And the leading to that is through a careful risk assessment, and just to emphasize that there's not a cavalier approach to this, that things are set up to consider about providers and things like that. And this could be a case with, often it's a sibling that wants to help. Sometimes it's parents. I do think there's a gendered aspect to this, because I've noticed that if it's a male survivor, there's an idea that, he needs to get his needs met, almost like a kid in a toy shop kind of thing. We need to met. When it's a female survivor, there's this more explicit concern about her vulnerability and exploitation. And that would be in the context of accessing sexual services, or in the context of renewing sex in a couple's relationship after a brain injury. There's quite a gender divide. It's interesting for me because one of the first few cases I've supported when I started doing this kind of work, the first case was a woman wanting to access a male escort, and then the second cases were gay men wanting to access male escorts. But the kind of, again, the social anxiety is of a man exploiting a woman, which is founded. But as you said, the dilemma is, how do you manage multiple vulnerabilities? So there's a lot of work that goes into potentially creating the conditions for someone to have the right kind of contact with the right sexual partner in a surrogate paid, or, and to have that in a way where capacity is optimized. Dating is not an optimization of capacity because it's so ambiguous. But someone wanting to have a specific encounter with a shared set of expectations of why two people are coming together, for what the limits are, and potentially to get feedback and coaching. That's the optimal ideal for work around sexuality, if someone wants to experience it outside of a relationship. So someone that I worked with well, it was a guy. He'd lost external sensation in his penis, so wasn't getting pleasure anymore through penetrating. Interesting point for a psychologist and neuro students. You'll see the homunculus, the brain's map of sensory inputs and motor outputs of the body. Where's the cock in that?
Should I get a picture of that?
Where's the vagina in that? Where's the anus in that? Where's the prostate in that? Right? The whole thing is gendered and culturalized when we're thinking about, this is just hardcore, this is just basic knowledge, objective knowledge about the brain and the body. Well, it's not really, because where is this stuff?
Yeah.
There's been a great development of studies looking at that and trying to map the erogenous zones as mapped out in the cortex.
In the
You're
cortex.
you're just making me think about my clients with spinal cord injury that have completely lost sensation
Absolutely.
from a certain point of their
Yeah.
injury, chest,
Yeah.
waist, whatever, and how do we work with those clients in a therapeutic capacity? And I'm just recalling one client that I worked with where this was in my early days, and it suddenly occurred to me that he couldn't feel anything. And I said, "You can't feel any of this, can you?" And he said, "Nope, I can certainly see it." And and in that
an enjoyment in
enjoying and see it, and it made me kind of think sexuality doesn't have to end because you have a severe injury. It just needs reframing.
Yeah.
And my job is, how can we reframe? How can we grieve what you can no longer do? How do we frame to make things more accessible? How do we slow things down so you have more chance to feel? How do we, there's a factor about them getting tired more quickly, perhaps, that sensation might be overwhelming sometimes, that they might need a sex aid, a wedge, a specific toy, a penis pump. It's a vast landscape, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's so much broader than just what is traditionally thought of.
Absolutely.
PIV. Yeah.
And this is the invitation to play in the venture. So with the person I was speaking about, he didn't get the same pleasure through penetrating, but he wanted to explore prostate stimulation. He wanted to be penetrated. He wanted to work with someone who would use toys and a strap on, and also explore the interpersonal dynamic around the change in that for he identified as being a straight man to experience that kind of passivity and submission, and but tenderness and sensations of being full and these kind of things. So how do you kind of, he was in lived in an annex in his adjacent to his family home with a load of carers. So getting from those wishes to be explored in an embodied way took quite a bit of work, but many people were open, and people wanting to support that creativity. Other examples you mentioned about slow sex, tantra. That's a really good fit for people with slowed information processing. If things happen too quickly. It's a really good fit for people who struggle with premature ejaculation. It's a really good fit for people who develop porn addictions and have just in loops of stimulation response and have lost the ability to have an embodied experience at all. So actually, the role of tantra is huge, I think, in slow sex in brain injury sexuality.
There's also from my experience of working with clients with TBI, is there's often a speech impairment or communication barrier involved. I don't know what the percentages are of TBI and speech impairment, but certainly the clients that I worked with, this was present. And so, that's another huge barrier, isn't it, to getting out there and meeting someone and dating, or having the possibility of, for some of my clients, the only option that they can see is sexual services or working with a sexual practitioner. And just going back to what we were saying about money, it's not cheap. And, why should you not have sexual expression because you're financially struggling?
What do you say to that?
Oh, the way that I worked, because I'm retired now, but the way that I worked is I had a titration of payments. So it was means tested and what you can afford, and then clients that had more money, or some clients that have big pockets of compensation money, they pay the full rate, so it kind of balances out. But that's just me. Not everyone works like that. Some people have their set rate and that's it, regardless of what your challenges are. But I don't think, and my mum said to me, money should never be a barrier to getting the things that you want in life. She also said never put anything in your vagina that you wouldn't put in your mouth. But there you go.
In general, what I'm loving is the creativity. So like doing things differently, thinking about finances, sliding scale, play, creativity, thinking about sex as more than just oral stimulation or PIV, etc., but thinking about different ways of doing things, tantra, slowing down. other forms of stimulation. I'm just curious from your experience if there's anything that comes to mind about a particular client that you've worked with where you feel like you had a really creative piece of work together that people might be interested in and could learn from.
That's both nodding.
Yeah.
This is what's great about this work, because it's just like the
Yeah.
conversations are just incredible. Do you want to go for
Yeah, I'm thinking about the first client that I worked with TBI, and I worked with him over a quite long period of time, on and off. But part of the work that I did with him is once we had completed our piece, as in our sessions, he then wanted to explore what his options were outside of the work that we'd done. So he understood consent. He had complete sexual function. He knew what he wanted, but he lacked opportunity. And so I created a pathway where I helped him access sex positive spaces and the sex positive community. And the last time I met the client, he was so he was a wheelchair user, but by the end of the work that we'd done together, he was actually out of the wheelchair and walking and had reclaimed function in his right hand, and he had been paralyzed down the right side of his body. Now, whether this was partly due to the sessions, I mean, there's neuroplasticity, but the fact that he was happy and he was getting on with his life and could see a future for himself, I don't think that that was coincidental. And the last thing that he said to me was, next time I come to this event, I am going to be naked in the sauna with everybody else, and I'm going to walk in there.
Wow.
And that was so incredibly beautiful to see, the transition from this client who, was really massively struggling on not just a sexual level, but, his mental health, his physical health, his social deprivation, the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really thrilled that was his trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think that I helped a little bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I just, because again, we know this in research, the intertwining of sexuality and mental health and self-identity, self-concept. So if the whole thing declines together, can you build it up together?
Yeah.
And do you view that blossoming in a clinical lens, in a humanistic lens, in a spiritual lens about this blossoming of someone? And I would really recommend listeners to check out Anna Smith Higgs.
Okay.
She is a stroke survivor who trained as a burlesque performer after her stroke, and she does you can find this performance on YouTube. She does an amazing performance where it starts off with a clinical backdrop and brain scans and things, and it moves out of that space into her recapturing and redefining and reauthoring of her identity as a woman, as a sensual being. Other voices here. It's the women that put the voice to this topic, actually. There's a stroke survivor in Portugal, Diana Wang Ramos, and she talked about wanting to have conversations to support her reintroduction as a sexual being, as a woman after her stroke, and feeling really let down by any conversations she had by clinicians, men and women, and say, why is there no conversational space?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So can I share my kinky story? Is that all right?
You can share your kinky story.
There's loads of them, but the one thing that I think is really important is an attachment lens, right?
Uh-huh.
That sex is based on play in an emotional safety together.
Yes.
Those two things are quite complicated interacting dimensions, and the book Meeting in Captivity,
Esther Perel,
thank you for that. She explores this, right? But it's a great framework for like feeling emotional security and safety to then as a platform to play and explore.
Yes.
And I think acquired disability and acquired disability kind of is a huge invitation into doing things differently. people may have had very vanilla sex lives before this, and then at a point feeling sex is gone to, as you said, well, what kind of sex? Can we actually sort of rewrite what sex is and explore that? I think then it becomes quite an exciting journey. But you need people to help and co-participate in that conversation about, let's redefine what sex is, let's get into this. But the one that comes to mind is a couple, and she was a survivor of brain injury. Her husband also had lots of disabilities himself, and she had a lot of mobility restrictions. She had aphasia, communicative restrictions, memory restrictions. We were working together to try and explore how sex would work with them. She was paralyzed, hemiparetic on one side. So there was a conversation about sexual positions. There was a conversation about different locations of sensitivity in her body that had changed. So her map of what turned her on changed. It was still there, but it was different. And she had to explore that. And this is the thing, she wasn't having they as a couple weren't exploring. She wasn't exploring as an individual. So they started to explore. What came out is that the sensation of water on her body was just tingling and electrifying, more so than ever was. So she wanted to have sex in the shower more, but she wanted to be on top, but she was worried about balance. So they needed to have some environmental support so that she could be in the shower on top of her husband and feel safe and to explore that. So we had to reach out to an OT and a conversation with a rehab supplier about, we want a mobility bar in the shower, but a bit lower than you would expect. They're like, why is it down for that way? So we have bespoke reasons for this. So we had to bring in all the logistics to support that sexual space, that sensual space.
I love that.
That was never part of their lives before, but it was just an amazing journey.
Wow, I love that.
That's so funny that you say exactly that, because I have a similar story. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, about placing a rail at a certain height in the shower to facilitate sexual expression. And other things as well, like the amount of times that I've worked with clients on those horrible single medicalized beds. Like, no, like, so part of it is like, where are we going to be doing this, and is the environment right, and do we have all the equipment that we need? And often it'll be a mattress on the floor, actually, and I get them out of a single medicalized bed, because it's like being on a bouncy castle for like 3 hours. My legs, like, I'm old now. So all of those things that we don't really think about until you're actually in a position being intimate with someone. It's like, oh, it'd be great if I just had the rail right here, or or wheelchairs. The amount of conversations I've had with manufacturers of wheelchairs, I'm like, please, can you design a wheelchair that you can have sex in? Yeah. And they look at me and they go, what? And I'm like, well, come on, do you not think that if you designed a chair specifically to have sex in, that you would sell a lot of units?
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, yeah, we never thought about that.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat this portion of the podcast and like sell it to providers. Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah.
I remember when we were meeting, you were telling me about how bonkers it was that you went out with someone and they wanted to go to a sex shop, and that was the activity, and it was going to be really fun. And then you got there and there wasn't a ramp, and you couldn't do the activity, but luckily someone came kind of running after you and saying, look, we've borrowed one from next door, let's go, we can make this work. But I mean, what about the structural barriers? It means that people with disability aren't being thought about.
And it's the same thing, they say that, we're disabled by our environment more than anything else.
Yeah.
Can I say there's a shout out to, I don't know the name, but there's a sex shop off the M1 somewhere in Lincolnshire that I keep hearing about. It's like it's an old abandoned Happy Eater. Like, it's on the side of a motorway.
Yeah.
And it's a huge sex shop, and it's big on the disability scene because of access, and apparently it's just amazing. But you have to get to like the kind of Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire borders to find this place. But apparently it's legendary. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and find it for the podcast notes. Maybe they'll sponsor this episode.
Shout out to them.
Shout out to them. I love that. Thank you
Yeah,
for
I
sharing
won't
that.
tell you the chain that didn't have the ramp, but let's just say it was one of the high-end chains, and I was very disappointed, but hopefully they have rectified that now. Yeah.
Yeah. Should we talk about sexual expression care
Yeah,
plans?
yeah,
Because that's fun and that's
yeah,
important and that's also practical.
yeah,
And we can think about doing that, helping
yeah,
people.
yeah. So I believe that that rehabilitation should cover sexual rehabilitation, and that the sooner you do that, the more you will prevent a crisis later on down the line. And one of the ways that we can do that is for all I call them clients, for all clients to have a sexual expression plan that's drawn up by their OTs or by their care team, and that will capture their sexual identity, orientation, wants, needs, desires, barriers, again, funding, facilitation, practitioners, like the whole thing, and it gets documented. And it's then a reference document that can be referred to, which, just to me is kind of a bit of a no-brainer to have that document. But the question is, who actually, whose job is it to conduct that assessment and collect that data and then enforce it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Who would you suggest? Who would you think?
Well, initially I thought OTs, but I since realised that OTs don't actually get very much training on sex and disability.
No one does.
No one does.
There's no
Exactly.
profession that leads the other. It's down to
Exactly.
individuals.
And with in my field, in somatic sexology, we don't get much training on the disability side of it. There's a little bit, but nothing practical. And when I first started working, I had an incredibly steep learning curve around manual handling and all of the different kinds of disabilities that I was coming up against, because it's a vast field, disability and sex. So there's definitely a training gap. And myself and some of my colleagues, we're all kind of like menopause now, and we want to hand the torch down to the younger practitioners coming up. But there is, at the moment, there is no official training in the UK to train others to do what me and some of my colleagues do. So that's the next step, I think.
The next step. Yeah.
Can I intersect with that?
Yeah.
Because one thing we were going to talk about social cognition, and so after brain injury, people have difficulties standing in someone else's shoes, adopting their perspective, feeling what someone else is feeling. We talked about that, recognizing different emotions, and then making responses and judgments based on gut feeling, knowledge about social norms and things. All is really complicated. And social cognition rehab has had the main paradigm of trying to teach skills in a kind of cold way. More recently, it's moved to interacting partners. So a communication partner. Leanne Tor in Australia talks about social communication partner, where someone has a buddy that gives them constant feedback about when they're being inappropriate socially. But it's a dynamic, and that fits with my work in couples therapy and family therapy, where you're working on those interactions between people, and also in a lot of relational orientated individual therapies too. What we're describing here is the potential of that kind of paradigm for supporting intimacy and coaching, where you've got someone, again, in a very specific space based on safety and predictions, is giving you feedback about what's going on for them and helping you think about what's going on for you in relation to them. There's the potential of a profession, of an experience, a rehab resource, steps to optimize capacity in a very specific setting that was beginning to be developed by yourself and colleagues. And my fear is that that's going to be lost. And so I echo that. How does this get passed on to develop this profession, to develop this conversation, develop these kind of skills and elements of support? Because that's like the missing ingredient in all of this stuff. Someone where it's not just about gratification, it's about coaching, interacting, building, building education, but in that embodied, interactive way.
Yeah.
That's the real kind of, if a profession or a partnership between professions emerges, I think that's when we know that this whole field is moving to where it needs to be.
Is that where you're hoping we'll go next, where you'll see things?
I mean, it's just conversations like Bea and hopefully other colleagues like her. That would be amazing. Yeah, but I'm worried because of all the constraints and the cultural that's going against a very strong tide.
Yes, yeah.
I need to get my book written, don't I? I need to finish it, get it out there, get it published.
Heck yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's next for you after retirement? Where do you want to go with this?
Well, it's finished the book. It's a collection of case studies of different clients that I've worked with different presentations, different disabilities, neurodivergence, incel, mature adult version. And who knows? All bets are off. Anything is possible. I just kind of see what opportunities come in, but it feels nice to have retired because I was tired. But I'm also worried about this knowledge being lost, and it really does need to be passed on and passed down. Yeah. I'll have to set up some training, won't I?
Yeah, I wonder if there's a way we can, formalize it or something.
I don't want to duplicate work that anyone else is doing. So like if the OTs are picking this up, then I don't want to duplicate that. If the care management agencies are doing sexual expression plans, or SEPs as we call them, then, I don't want to push that out there. So at the moment, I'm still kind of feeling into what is being done, what is sticking, and where the gaps are, where the bottlenecks are. So there's a kind of a piece of, evaluating where we're at now and what needs to be done going forward.
What do you think, Giles, I guess from a sort of research perspective, or kind of, what do you think needs to be done to move things forward?
The strength of the research has been in the kind of the surveys and understanding nature's problem, but although there's some gaps there, again, just matching what I read with what people are telling me. People talk about changes in sexual orientation or diversifying of kinks and things. I don't read that in the research papers, but that idea of movement and change and transition in sexual identity, I think, needs to be captured more. And then the kind of support work, the intervention work. Again, Australia's kind of leading the way on this. They did a bit of Jenny Ponsford's work, and her team. Big shout out to Professor Ponsford and her postdoctoral students, and they've done some stuff on. They've developed a CBT model for sexuality changes, but it was mixed results because CBT in different contexts. Cognitive behavioural therapy in this context, there's a risk of that. It has a couple of other meanings in these spaces.
That's where I went. I just went right there.
But I think that it. Before intervention, it was just like education in a really dry way, drawing on learning disability stuff mainly, and so that's getting better. But it's people always said they want the conversations, and they want to explore. They want an exploratory psychotherapy to explore this. They want live partner-based work to explore this. So that's where it needs to go, I think, and I think. There's a recognition that it needs to go that way. So we just need the clinicians and researchers and the sexologists and the coaches to kind of get together and develop this.
It sounds like there's kind of a role for a little bit of the drier stuff around capacity, risk, etc. But where we want to see things going is more about the live conversations, the creativity.
We need intellectual intercourse. We need merging. We need intercourse. We need merging rather than people staying in their silos, because we need the connection is what will make this kind of go forward in new fields and new pioneering work.
Thank you both so much for giving me your time. I feel like I could really just talk at length with you both and hear more.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you so much. I've truly been looking forward to that. Truly, and it's been such a pleasure to speak to you. I wish we had all afternoon. but you're both busy. I'm busy and when we have to go back to our lives, but I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Yeah.
for inviting me.
Yeah,
thank you
it's
for
a great
coming.
opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for traveling all this way and for speaking. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Wired for Hope today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this episode, you can like, subscribe, and follow, or follow me on Instagram at Dr. Jess Neuropsych or at Wired for Hope podcast. If you want to hear more about my personal reflections or the context for the interview, head over to where you get your audio-only podcasts, such as on Apple, and I'll share a little bit more about the context for the video and who the speakers are in those episodes. Please note that this is not a substitute for direct psychological advice or support, and you can check out the podcast notes for a list of services in the UK to support you with your mental health or after brain injury. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.